I want to talk about an idea that's really wild, possibly one of the greatest ideas ever. It's one that comes from Carl Sagan, who was a popular scientist in the 80s. And the idea is that we are a way for the universe to know itself. Another way it's commonly put is that we are instances of the universe becoming conscious. It's important to note there's no sort of spiritual implications here. It's completely a physical perspective. But if that's the case, if it's not spiritual, what the hell does this mean, right? I think it's an idea that's really hard for us to understand because it inherently goes against the way humans naturally look at the world. So I'm going to dig into that a bit and explain like why it's so important, and hopefully by the end of this it's really clear why this idea is so huge. So I think one idea that's really relevant to mention in order to understand this one is another idea from Sagan, which is that we are made of star stuff. And basically, what he means by this is that besides hydrogen, helium, and lithium, which were all created during the Big Bang, atoms of every other element were created in stars. So everything that makes up our body, everything that we see comes from stars. Everything. And really, you could take that logic even further because stars were created and are created because of the accumulation of gas and dust. And throw in thermonuclear fusion, and you get stars. But all of that comes from the origin of the universe. And so, really, when you look at it from that perspective, everything comes from the same source. And so, looking at the universe in its entirety, you can see it as a single thing. You can look at it in terms of unity. Something else that's big in understanding all of this is an idea from the German philosopher Nietzsche. And he says that words and concepts are just metaphors. And to explain what this means, like our notion that a car is a car, that a human is a human, the names that we tie to people we know, the concepts we assign to objects, none of those things are laws of nature. Like the fact is that we're just animals, and the world is a complex place. And so, in order to break up that complexity, we've like assigned concepts and categories to things, so that way we can digest the world and be able to communicate about it effectively. But Nietzsche makes the very strong point that we've forgotten that we're the ones who have casted concepts onto the world. And that, again, like the only thing that is fundamentally true is the set of laws of physics. I think this sort of stuff becomes even more clear if you start thinking about like how different languages can be. Like there are a lot of words and ideas that exist in some languages and just don't exist in others. And I think even words that carry similar meaning, often like meaning still gets lost in translation just because like the cultural context in which those words were created were completely different. And I think in general, even converting like emotions and thoughts into words, even meaning gets lost there because it's like you're taking something as complex as a thought or an emotion and like distilling it into a discrete set of words. And in some cases, that can feel like it's impossible to sort of convey how you're feeling into words alone. So another thing I think is relevant to talk about is Einstein. Just about everybody has heard of or knows of E equals MC squared. But I think there's a really key, like hidden idea there. So like that equation basically says that matter and energy are two forms of the same thing, that essentially they're no different. And I think that's key because so many scientific breakthroughs have been the sort of bridging the gaps between two concepts that we thought were distinct, but it turns out they were just the same thing. Like so many of Einstein's realizations have like been of that kind. There's his equivalence principle, which is that inertial and gravitational mass are the same thing. We have the term space-time, which is a reflection of the fact that space and time are two aspects of the same thing. During his time, there were only two forces of nature, and he was bothered by that. Turns out there's more forces of nature. So like the main point here is that Einstein was really bothered by discreteness, like the idea that there are things in the world that are fundamentally different from one another, and that there's a discrete set number of a certain thing. Like that sort of thing bothered him a lot. And I think it's funny how like simply questioning that, like simply thinking like maybe, I can think of this more so as a spectrum or think about it more in a continuous way, how that can lead to so many brilliant conclusions. But yeah, I think that all of these topics kind of hint towards the same thing, which is that the world is a continuous place. That it's better to understand things in terms of a unified whole, and that things aren't necessarily fundamentally different. And I think like just looking at the world in this way is I think that perspective is more reflective of reality. I mean, to give some examples, like if you think about a calendar is discrete because you know exactly how many days and weeks are in a year. The problem is that it doesn't really capture a true solar year because a solar day isn't exactly 24 hours and a solar year isn't exactly 365 days. And so because of that, over time, your calendar year gets out of sync with the true year. And that's exactly why we have leap years, in order to like correct for that difference. Not even to mention that our calendar is just one of many. Ours is the Gregorian calendar. But yeah, calendars are imperfect because they're discrete. I think you could try to make the argument that like our sense of self is discrete and true, and that our consciousness like must be distinct from the world. But I think that's sort of challenged by the fact that the human body is more like a colony of living things with hundreds of trillions of bacteria, fungi, and viruses. And the key thing is that they can even influence our mood and our behavior. The human body has more bacterial DNA than it does human DNA. A single person has communities of bacteria that's unique just to their own body. And so like considering how like these living things are integral to how the human body works, and how much bacteria and fungi you ingest on a daily basis can affect your mood and your behavior. I think looking at it from that perspective, it's not really right to see it as like all of your actions are serving the single entity that you see as the self. It's more like you're serving the conglomerate of living things that, together run your body. I think another thing that could be argued is that, well, life is definitely discrete and we know it to be true and it's clearly different from non-living things. But I think that not even that is true because, I mean, if you take something like viruses, for example, it very clearly straddles the border between what's living and what's not living, and very highlights that gray area. Obviously, they have lifelike qualities to them, but viruses are even likened to nomadic genes that just travel place to place. So you can definitely just sort of throw them in that gray area and look at life as more of a spectrum. On a smaller scale, synthetic organic molecules evolve and mutate in an environment. And the first lifelike thing on Earth was probably a self-replicating catalytic RNA molecule. So, it's funny because with that perspective, asking the question of like, when did life arise on Earth doesn't really make a lot of sense because there probably wasn't a single moment where an object acquired all of the criteria that we have for life. Better question is like, when did the first lifelike thing happen on Earth? By the way, a separate note, but planets and stars aren't fundamentally distinct from each other either. I mean, you can think of a planet basically as a failed star, having not accumulated enough mass to become a star. But at the end of the day, all of them are just objects whose where things happen differently depending on how much mass they accumulate, what type of elements they have, that sort of thing. So piecing all of this stuff together to make sense of Carl Sagan's idea that we are a way for the universe to know itself, we get there by applying the continuity principle, by looking at the world as a continuous whole, stripping away all the concepts that we've projected onto it. And when you do that, what you get is oneness. You get a unified whole. And it's for that reason that you can see ourselves as a part of the universe in a very real and physical way. Each of us just being an instance of the universe becoming conscious for a little while. And then with death, we return to the initial unconscious state. But yeah, it's a really insane idea because, like, just learning, thinking, feeling emotion, doing those things, we grant the universe that ability. Like, just by being alive, we allow the universe to be conscious for a little while. And again, I have to stress no spiritual undertones here. Our mind wants to default into that thinking because we see ourselves as not natural beings. We see ourselves as separate from the world around us, but it's just not the case. So yeah, it's really an unbelievable idea. Definitely the greatest one I've come across. But let me know what you think in the comments. I'm like really curious to see what people have to say about this. But yeah, if you enjoy it, hit me with a like, hit me with a share, and appreciate you for tuning in. Peace.